The translation of Esther Graham by J. Marshall Mather. It isn't ony fool that can fire up. Seems easy chucking coals on like that, doesn't it? And the old man shot the fuel along the roaring furnaces, kindling them into a still brighter glow. But I tell you, it isn't ony fool that can do it. Then clashing to the door and leaning on his shovel, the sweat the while pouring off his face, he continued, "It's not my job, as you know, but my mate's down with influenza, and him as is doing for him can't fire up to my liking." And once more the old man turned to the boiler fires and pursued his self-imposed task. In a little while he again paused in his labour, and turning round said, "Don't you know what makes a gradely fire-beater?" I confessed my ignorance, much to his professional disgust. "Well, I'll tell you," said he, oracularly. "Economy in coal, economy in smoke, and steady pressure. When I were on job, I burnt a couple of load less nor ony man in valley as had same tackle to keep agate, and there were never a volcany coming out at top of my chimney, no steam blowing off from my valves neither. To me all this talk was in an unknown tongue, nor was I interested in it, save that I knew it would lead up to one of those stories in which he was so rich, and which he would narrate so well, for from being shoppy he often became interesting, at times even original. Addressing me again, he said, "You don't tap somehow to boil as you tap to engine. I mean, you don't feel akin to it in same fashion. Though, number 2 there could tell a tale if it couldn't but speak." "It has its chronicler in you, though," I replied. "It's what?" he asked. "Its chronicler. I mean, you could speak for it if you liked." "If you mean I could turn Queen's evidence, you rate, for his blood on those plates," and he struck the middle boiler with his shovel, as though some past recollection roused desire. "And yet I don't know at it were its own fault either, and by mass, it were no fault of mine. That'll swear ony day afore onybody." "An explosion?" I said. "Nah, that's it. There's aboon one crippling village that lost their limbs by it, to say nought of a 2-3 mounds up in Chapel Yard that wouldn't have been there but for its Malc. But it's too hot for lights of you down here. Come up aboon and I'll tell you." I followed the old man into the shed, seating myself by his side, the only discomfort being the pungent fumes from the rank clay, with the rhythmic whiffs of which he punctuated his story. With this, however, there was no dispensing. His pipe was the live coal that touched his tongue and made him eloquent. "It were when the great revival were agate, and that's aboon 35 years sin. Not as revivals is aught in my line. I've hardly time for eating or sleeping, let alone shouting and praying. I know but mentioned the revival because it has to do with me tale." Reference to revivals set my ears at once on the tingle, for their phenomena had long been my study, and they possessed for me a fascination greater even than the romance of machinery, or the heroics of labour, the recounting of which has so drawn me to this old man's side. So, to enlarge the limits of his story, I asked, what revival was that? "And you never yeared?" he cried in tones of surprise, as though the facts of a quarter of a century ago were common information to strangers. I shook my head. "What, never yeared of Peter Ruddock that come from Yorkshire, and get the whole village converted in 6 weeks, all but me, an infidel Jack, and a 2-3 more at same breed?" "No," I said, "I never heard of him." "By Guy, but there were some goings on in those times, I can tell you. Everybody were bound to glory, as they call it." "Everybody but you and infidel Jack," I suggested. "Yai, and a 2-3 more as weren't ta'en in that road, but I mun get on with me tale. An infidel Jack brings me back to it. Jack had a lass, an only child who were, called Esther. I come to give her a name out of Bible I don't know, for like as he never opened it but to find fault with it, or to show us that how Moses were a greatly liar, or summat, and King David a deal were. On he rode. Either he or Mrs. caught lass after the Queen of the Old Testament. Here the story came to a full stop, a succession of whiffs from the melodious pipe, accounting for the pause. The old man, the meanwhile, looking into the smoke wreaths, as though therein he saw the departed actors of the scene he was seeking to recall. Soon, however, he continued, who were a clever lass were Esther, who were for sure, always either reading or rooting among plants and yarbs, and there was summat said who were of her feyther's way of thinking. What, an infidel? I asked. Somehow that sort. It wasn't but what folks said, though, for who were a decent lass and kept a still tongue in her head. On he rode, who were not greatly religious, as they call it, who didn't go to chapel and Sunday school, but walked with her feyther in fields gathering yarbs and flowers, when t'others were agate a singing and saying their prayers. Well, one night, when the revival were agate, Esther thought to go out of curiosity like. I don't mean to mak gam, for who weren't a lass of that sort, but to see and hear what were going on, for they getting agate a shouting and pouncing forms, till all the countryside were fain to join 'em. Them that were there that night told me after that Esther were a bit frightened at first, and wanted to get out, but the door oil were choked with crowd, and who were like to stop where who were. When preaching were o'er and prayer meeting were in full swing, a lass as wove next to Esther, and a getting converted, stood in communion to give what they call a testimony, and then sang a bit of a ditty. It seemed to fair fetch Esther, poor lass. I believed who cried to some tune that night, and it ended with her getting converted and all. Here came another pause, filled up by a succession of obnoxious whiffs. Then the old man wandered into a soliloquy. I wonder how it is there's more women gets converted than men. Happen it's a good job, for they need it more. They're a queer lot at best. Not as I've word to say again Esther, who were as good as the Mackem, either in this world or t'other any road. That neat who get new made o'er again, as they call it. And you may suppose the news run fast, and when Esther get home, if either was standing at door, with anything but an angel's smile on his face. What's this I hear about thee? He asked, shapping his mouth for a curse and a good money on 'em and all. No, but what's good, says the lass. Thee and thy goodness, he shouted. There's no room for converted folk in this house. They mun either give up to one or t'other. Come, feyther, that gammon, who says. To one or t'other, he shouted, and pushed her off threshold into garden pad, where who fell and cut her head on scraper. Bagging herself up, who brast into tears, and said, Feyther, dost a mean it? Thou knows me too well to ask that question, he says. To one or t'other I tell thee, and be damned to thee. Then who turned on her heel into the night, leaving him stammering and staring in dark. At first his missus said he made as though he would have gone after her, but his back were up, and turning to the woman, who were crying, he told her as yon were a specimen of the followers of him as said he'd come to divide our souls and set children against the fathers and mothers. And what became of Esther? I asked, now fully interested in the story, and eager for the climax which the old man was keeping so well in the background. Hold on a bit, or I shall mar me tale. And once more he looked up at the smoke rings for the faded forms that peopled his story, drawing inspiration the while from his companionable pipe. It were in winter time when Jack quarrelled with his lass, and he went ground with white, and a yeast wind howling off moors, half moon shining with his face downwards, as though he were bound to blow a bit more snow. I'd gone in boiler oil to get warm like, and were carrying it noot, when all at once I chanced to look up and see'd a woman standing at top of coal tip. By Guy, I says to myself, what's up now? There's a Malc gate and no mistake, and I lay snug in shadow, thinking as I should know more if I didn't show myself. For a bit who stood still as if who were harding, then who ramped down cold tip and come close again where I was sitting. That's him for it now, lad, I thought, and I were none so pleased, I can tell you, at the thoughts of spending neat with a woman in fire oil. So I shuffles me clothes and gives asthmatic cough. Then lass spoke. Harry, is that you? Who says. Yai, who else should it be? I asked. But what's hard to do in here, and a night like this and all? A quarrel with me feyther, who says. A quarrel with thy feyther? Yai, I've found salvation, and he says there's no room for converted folk in our house. Thou's been a very silly lass, I said. What did to want with getting converted? Thou were good enough as thou were. Thou should have left well alone. Then who put her hand on me shoulder. Harry, who says, I've getting a new heart. Tak care as there doesn't swap were, for they're not all angels as is converted. But say they, I'm not going to talk religion with such as they, and I made as though I was bound to leave her. Can't you find me a place to lie down in? Who says. I were in a quandary like. How Jack and me were mates, and I couldn't see tacking again him. At the same time I couldn't turn again his own flesh and blood. At last I says, thou can sleep in th' engine house if thou's a mind, and I fun her some sacking and seed a reap for neat, as I thought. But bless you, the lass never slept, who did naught but sing and pray, till th' old engine house were like the prison where Paul and t'other chap were put for preaching. I felt none so easy, I can tell you, but I were fain to listen. Who did treble it that neat? Who'd always a gradely voice, but I'd never heard her sing in that fashion afore. It were grand. Who getting out of a bit of him, as the revival folk sung about a name as were high over all, and who couldn't drop it. Who kept at it o'er and o'er again, and every now and then who shouted out, Glory! I'm none a religious chap, as you know, but I were nearer to better shop that neat, cowering by th' engine house door, than ever were afore or sin, or ever shall be again for that matter. A bit afore 6 o'clock, who come out to her work, and as the gas leaked up her face, it fair shone. I can see her now as who stepped out that morning, her shawl fallen back o'er her shoulders, her ear looking upwards, as though who saw summat, and her mouth opened as who said, Glory! Well, that's a corker, I says, and I went and set th' engine again. They say at that morning afore breakfast hour, the waving shed were like a oratory. Well, all the lasses are getting converted at the revival, and they did naught but sing about the name high over all. The tacklers tell me that they fair drowned the sound of the shuttles, and it took some lung power to do that, I can tell you. I dare say you think I'm a long while getting to th' end of me tale, but it's well done. Boilers, you mun know, is nobbut like human beings. You may put too much on 'em, and if you don't, the best on 'em will wear away. They want a bit of looking after, and they get it now, but in days I'm speaking on, the meisters were no one particular. There were no inspectors agate then. Well, number 2 yon had been wasting away, and nobody were any wiser, until it whackened 'em with blowing its front out. I'd just left boiler house as good luck or ill luck for the matter that would have it, for I'm noan so sure at them as is living or them as is dead, as the best done it. I'd just left the boiler house, I tell you, and I'd turned round to factory end, when I heard a terrible noise as I could liken to naught I ever heard afore nor sin. It seemed fair to rive there in pieces and lift ground under me feet. "That's in the boiler house," I said, and ran round into the yard, but I could see naught, for steam were everywhere. As I were making me way, me foot come against summat the like of which it never touched afore. "What's that?" I asked myself, for I could tell by feel it were neither wood nor iron, nor anything, as I knew, were lying about the yard. So, stooping down, I groped into steam until I got out on it, and found it was soft and warm, and when I drew me hand back, it were wheat and red, and not with paint neither. I'm known a white plucked 'em, but for once in my life I lost me nerve and ran up and down shouting and swearing, blinded and maddled with steam. It weren't long afore I banged up against manager. "Nay, Harry," he says, "come lad, pull thyself together." But he no sooner spoken than he tumbled o'er summat hisself and measured his length in snow. It were a lass, poor thing, with her face scalded the colour of a red Indian and a head smashed in like a egg. Then he lost his nerve and all, and I could see his face were as white as ground he piped himself up from. In a bit, when the wind had lifted steam, we took in our bearings. Talk about seats, it were like a knacker's yard. There were 2 on 'em blown to jam rags, and arms and legs that were never to work nor run ony more were scattered about like branches after a back-end storm. I looked at the old man's immobile face as he recounted these horrors, a piece of granite, so set was every feature, anointed with the sweat of labour, and wrinkled by the restless hand of years. Then the muscles slowly relaxed, and a tear started from his countenance of rock, and turning to me he said, "You guess the rest." I nodded. "Yea, poor lass, who were a monk killed, but who weren't touched, not a bone broken, nor a scrap on her skin nowhere. It were what the doctor called death from shock. I helped to carry her into wagon house, where they were laying out the dead, and her face was same as when I seed her come out at th' engine house 3 hours afore, all lighted up as if who'd seen him as who sang about. Him, as they said, were high over all. The first man I see on the job after this was Peter Ruddock, and I'll say this for th' chap, he knew how to fashion hisself to dying folk. He walked up and down quiet like, and he'd hold their hands and shap his tongue in prayer like angel. I'm no untacken, as you know, with parsons, but I believe in giving everybody their due. It weren't long afore Jack come running up, about cap or coat, winter as it were, and asking everybody after Esther. Some of the folks knew naught about her, and them as did said naught, because they were feared on him. At last he seed me, and getting out on me, said, "Where's lass?" But I were the same as the rest, I said naught. Then Ruddock come up, and laying his hand on Jack's shoulder, he said, "Thy lass is up aboon. The bridegroom called her, and who were ready." I expected naught but Jack would ha' knocked him down or else cursed him to his face, but he did neither. He let him lead him away as quiet as a little child.